Good day, everybody. I hope that you are well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 8 English lesson on point of view. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once we've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of English Language Arts, grade 8. And then we're going to scroll down up until we get to our chapter of identity, chapter of point of view. All right. So when it comes to point of view, right? And before we go to point of view, we said that our chapter is point of view. Our subject is English Language Arts. Grade 8. And the lessons that we are going to be focusing on is to identify the narrative point of view. All right. So when it comes to the point of view, right, and us identifying the narrative point of view, so the narrative point of view is whether the narrator of the story is the voice that is telling or narrating the story, right? So you have a narrator, and a narrator is someone that is either the voice that is telling the story or the voice that is narrating the story. And the narrative's point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. It is being told from the narrative's point of view or wherever. There are three main points of views when it comes to the point of view, right? So there's three main point of view. You have a first person, second person, and we have third person. So we have the first person, second person, and third person, right? So we mentioned that we have three main points, and when we talk in the first person, right? When we talk in the first person, then the narrator describes events from his or her own perspective. Because remember, we are saying now that the narrator of a story is the voice of the story. All right. So also when it comes to the first person, right? So we said with the first person, the narrator describes events from his or her own perspective, right? But also first person narrators use first person pronouns, right? So with narrating it and telling it in your own words or from your own perspective, right? You're also using words that's basically first person pronouns. And first person pronouns are words like I, me, we, and us. All right. If we look at an example, right, it says, I waded slowly across the river, holding my backpack high above the water. And there we start with the narrator's basically perspective or own perspective, the narrator's point of view, by starting with, I wandered slowly across the river, holding my backpack high above the water. Then we have second person, right? And if we write within the second person, then the narrator casts the reader as a character in the story. So as a reader, you will feel as if you are basically in the story. Second person narrators, they use second person pronouns, and the second person pronouns are words like you and your. And if we look at an example of the second person where the narrator casts you as a reader, as a character in the story. If we look at the example, it says you turn the page in anticipation, eager to find out where the story will lead. That is the third person. All right, so once again, we're talking about point of view, and remember the point of view is basically how I perceive something, see something, right? And how you describe something. And with the point of view, we have the narrator that tells a story, that is the voice of the story, right? That's narrating a story. And the narrator's point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. So whether you are also writing a story and then you need to, for example, give a point of view, you will give it in the first person way, right? So first person, and that is where you give your point of view, you state your point of view based on your own perspective, right? You describe events from your own perspective. All right. Then we said that also with the third person, right? We said that the narrator describes events from the perspective of an outside observer. The third person narrator uses the third person pronouns. Because remember, now you are in the third person. It is the narrator describes it as an outside observer. All right. So when it comes to these three different points of views, right? Remember, whether you give your point of view in the first person, whether you give it in the second person or in the third person, your view is still being, it still comes across or still being given across, right? So you're just gonna have to be careful whenever you write or you read something, read a story specifically, and then you're gonna have to identify whether the person is saying it in the first person voice, and that is basically showing or describing the events from his own perspective, and they use, and in order for you to see if it's using the first person, they are using words like I, me, we, and us. And then also, in order for you to still also, can you hear me? And now, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now when I talk, or you still can hear me? Oh, okay. All right. So when we have a third person, right? So the narrator of the story, we say is the voice, right? So in the third person, when you write or when you have a story, right? So if you were to even to identify the point of view of maybe another narrator in a story, then you just look at what the narrator described, how the event is being described from his or her own perspective. Oh, okay. Thank you. So even if you, for example, write something or you were to read a story, sometimes they ask what is the point of view within the story, or sometimes they were to ask you what is your point of view when you, for example, have to either read a specific story or a novel, right? And sometimes we give it in our first person, we give it in the second person, or we give it in the third person. But you need to give it in a manner in, are you giving your own perspective, of what's happening in the story? Or if you are, for example, casting the reader as a character in the story, right? So however you are going to give your point of view across, you are going to have to describe it in the manner of Is it in the first person, in the second person, or in the third person? Within the third person, right? Usually the third person has a limited point of view, right? It is basically just you as a reader giving your knowledge on what the maybe the novel is about, what the story is about, and then you give your point of view based on that, but more on a limited basis. So your knowledge is very limited to what a single character knows and feels, right? Because within a text, within a story specifically, we read a story, we read a novel, and then most times we cannot even give our point across because you don't really feel the character, you don't know the character, right? So a third person, it's more like it's giving limited point. It's giving more of a limited point of view. Pardon. The observer's knowledge is limited, which is basically yours, to what a single character knows and feels, right? But also with a third person, it really depends. It can vary because within a third person, the narrator also describes the events from the perspective of an outsider's view, right? And the narrator uses third person pronouns such as oh, he, she, him, and her, as well as maybe giving the characters names, but it is not, you don't make it more personal. So it doesn't sound more personal. So with third person, it is more of you just giving your view, but you are not, going deep into, what the story is about. You're not making the story sound personal. You don't make the story sound as if you are in the story, right? And if we look at an example of a third person, let me say that Maria wondered whether her neighbor's laugh was genuine. So sometimes that is almost like just it's like basically just re-describing or repeating, for example, whatever that is written within the story already. So now they maybe say, okay, give your point of view on something. And maybe you just say like, oh no, Maria wondered whether her neighbor's laugh was genuine. But it's not really tackling like deep into why Maria wondered whether her neighbor's laugh was genuine or not. Because now her neighbor's laugh was contagious. Her neighbor's laugh was however the neighbor's laugh was being described. But now you just say as a third person that Maria wondered whether her neighbor's laugh was, was it actually genuine? All right. So this is basically our point of view. And remember, when it comes to writing, not even writing, when it comes to especially interpreting your novel specifically, or stories, or narrating stories, or even writing a story, the narrator, once again, of the story is the voice that is telling or narrating the story. And the narrator's point of view is the perspective from which a story is told, right? Sometimes we become narrators in the story if you were to retell the story, especially if you were to write reviews on the story. You become the narrator by basically telling us or narrating the story and giving your point of view or your perspective. But so if it comes to, especially if you write reviews, then you need to keep in mind, is it in the first person, or I basically narrating it in the first person, the second person, or in my limited view or my limited point of view, which is in the third person. All right, so now we're going to, let's go to aplusstudents.ca, and then we're going to identify the narrator's point of view. All right. So I just made mention of the narrator's point of view, right? the narrator being the one that tells the story, narrating the story, and giving his or her point of view of what the story is really about, his or her perspective. And we said it is given either in the first person, second person, or it is being given in the third person. And once again, before we continue, right, by doing our activity, pardon, in the first person, right, you need to keep in mind that the narrator uses the first person pronouns such as I, me, we, and us, right? In the second person, the narrator uses pronouns such as you and your, because it's not referring to the next person, right? Because in the first person, it is more personal. It's like me doing something. It's like I'm doing something, right? We or us, giving our perspective from that as if we are in the story. In the second person, it's like you're describing another character, right? You're casting another reader as a character in the story, right? Making mention of that specific character, right? And in the third person, we say that the narrator has a limited knowledge. It's more like just an observer's knowledge. And you use words like he, she, him, her, or you give the characters names. So it doesn't become much personal, right? All right, so now we're going to look at our activity. It says, which point of view does the narrator use in the passage? So we're either going to say if the narrator uses the first person point of view, the second person point of view, or if the narrator uses the third person point of view within the story. All right, so it says, I like the sound of Rowdy's laughter. I don't hear it very often, but it's always sort of this avalanche of ha ha and ho ho and he he. I like to make him laugh. He loves my cartoons. He's a big, goofy dreamer, too, just like me. So we don't need to say, is this in the first person point of view, second person point of view, or third person point of view? Specifically look at the pronouns. And then we can say, is this in the first person point of view, second person point of view, or third person point of view? All right. And if we were to choose the correct, to say whether it is in the first person, second person, or third person point of view, and then we're going to say this is in the first person point of view. So this is basically in the first person point of view, and we know so even based on the pronouns that is being used. Like I like the sound of of Rowdy's laughter. I don't hear it quite often, just like me, right? So that is so I like to make him laugh. Those are also words that stand out, and that is why I went back to the notes, and I said that you need to specifically also look at the pronouns, because that is something that stands out that will tell you if it is either in the first person, second person, or the third person. All right, let's go to the test. All right, so here we have a let's read this the passage or the text, and then we're gonna have to say which point of view the narrator used the passage in. Is it first person, second person, or third person? It says Jessica stepped into the room, closed the door, and stood with her back to it. My son loves, she thought. My son loves and is human. Paul looked at his mom. She told the truth. He wanted to get away alone and think this experience through, but he knew he could not leave until he was dismissed. And that is from Frank Herbert, Dune, copyright 1965. Is that in the first person, second person, or the third person? Do we use it in the first person, second person, or in the third person? All right. So if we specifically look, especially at the pronouns that is being used, like he and she, right? Emphasis are usually are mainly put on that, like he and she and her, right? That basically gives us an idea that it is in the third person. Yes, well done. Third person is correct. So well done. That is why I said, look, sometimes the pronoun specifically that is being used will tell us if it's in the first person, second person, or third person, but well done. Okay, we need to say which point of view does the narrator use in the passage. It says, I like the sound of Rowdy's laughter. I don't hear it very often, but it's always sort of this avalanche of ha ha and ho ho and he. I like to make him laugh. He loves my cartoons. He's a big, goofy dreamer, too, just like me. Is that in the first person, second person, or in the third person? So it says, I like the sound of Rowdy's laughter. I don't hear it very often, but it's always sort of this avalanche of ha ha and ho ho and he. I like to make him laugh. He loves my cartoons. He's a big, goofy dreamer too, just like me. Is that point of view in the first person point of view, second person point of view, or third person point of view? All right, and if we were to identify if it's either in the first person, second person, or third person, we can say this is in the first person. All right. We now need to say which point of view does the narrator use in the passage. It says Jonas went to his own desk and began to sort through his school papers for the evening's assignment. But his mind was still on December and the coming ceremony. Though he had been reassured by the talk with his parents, he hadn't the slightest idea what assignment the elders would be selecting for his future, or how he might feel about it when the day came. So we now need to say, is this in the first person, the second person, or in the third person? All right. And if we were to select which point of view does the narrator use in the passage, then yeah, we can say this is in the third person point of view. Mainly the names are being used, he or she is being used, right? It's very limited vocabulary about the basically about the person, the character. So well done. Third person is correct. Well done. All right, the next one says they worked together for an hour or more without speaking. Ellen was grave and absorbed in the anxious thoughts of that spring. Jethro was accustomed to adapting himself to the behaviors and moods of older people, and he found enough in the world about him to occupy his interest as he worked. If I read that again, they say they worked together for an hour or more without speaking. Ellen was grave and absorbed in the anxious thoughts of that spring. Jethro was accustomed to adapting himself to the behaviors and moods of older people, and he found enough in the world about him to occupy his interest as he worked. We need to say if that is in the first person, second person, or third person. So, first person, second person, or third person. All right, and if we were to select which point of view, then we can say it is the third person, right? More of the names are being used, right? Limited vocabulary is being used. All right, the next one says, here you come, better late than never. A face presentation, not the boy your father so desperately wanted, but here you come anyway. All 6 pounds, 3 ounces of you, button nose, conical head, good color, a swirl of dark hair atop your little crown, and a healthy pair of lungs, too. So, is that in the first person, second person, or third person? All right, and if we were to select the correct one, I think this sounds like the second person. All right, so that is the second person. You, your is mainly being used where you're mainly focusing on casting the character as or narrating the character as, within the story. All right, so this is now the end of our lesson on point of view. We said that when it comes to point of view, the the narrator is somebody that tells a story. The narrator is a story. The narrator of a story is the voice that is telling or narrating the story. And the narrator's point of view is the perspective from which the story is then being told. And then it's either being told in the first person, in the second person, or it's being told in the third person. All right, and that is basically the point of view of the narrator, right? But this is the end of our lesson. Thank you very much, grade 8, for joining the class, and I really hope that you're going to have a good evening further. Goodbye.